You ever hear about someone being at the wrong place at the wrong time, and it costing them everything? That's the story of James Carter. Quiet man, a hard worker, a father, and, for 17 years, an inmate serving life for a crime he didn't commit. Now, you'd think justice would be smarter than that. That in America, in the so-called land of due process and second chances, an innocent man couldn't just vanish behind bars like that. But James did. And he didn't just vanish, he was buried. By a system designed to ignore people who look like him. A system more interested in closing cases than telling the truth. He was 28 years old when it happened. Had a stable job at a warehouse. No record. Never even had a parking ticket. But one damn night, the corner store near his house gets robbed. Clerk ends up shot. Surveillance footage is grainy. No clear face. All they know is, black man, medium build, wore a hoodie. James becomes a suspect because he walks past that same store every evening after his shift. No witnesses, no weapon, just proximity. They pick him up, ask a few questions, twist his words, pressure him. Next thing he knows, he's being booked. Next thing he knows, he's wearing an orange jumpsuit. Next thing he knows, he's on trial for armed robbery and attempted murder. His public defender barely said more than 10 words. Didn't interview witnesses. Didn't challenge the ballistics report. Didn't even bring up the fact that James had clocked out of work after the robbery took place. But the jury, mostly white, quick to believe the man in the suit, the prosecutor with the confident smile, and quicker to fear the quiet black man sitting next to the barely awake public defender. They found him guilty in less than 2 hours. 2 hours. Life in prison. No parole. Now, most people break under that. They give up. Fade into the cracks of concrete and steel. James almost did. But something kept him alive. Maybe it was spite. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the stubborn belief that one day, the truth might actually matter. He spent the first year in silence. He read. He listened. He watched. Then he found the prison library. And in it, one broken, dusty copy of Black's Law Dictionary. He read it cover to cover. Twice. Then came the law textbooks. Old trial transcripts. Supreme Court opinions. He taught himself the language of the courtroom. The mechanics of justice. The loopholes. The buried rights most inmates didn't even know they had. He began to help others. Writing appeals, reviewing cases, finding the cracks that lazy lawyers and overworked defenders never noticed. Word spread. If you're serious about your appeal, go see Carter. The guards didn't like it. The warden warned him, said he was disturbing the order. But James didn't stop. He spent 11 years working on his own case, digging into police reports, filing Freedom of Information requests, reaching out to innocence organizations, most of whom never responded. Until one day, a paralegal from a civil rights nonprofit came to visit him. She'd read a letter he wrote, and she brought something with her, an affidavit, from a former employee of the prosecutor's office. Inside it, evidence that would shake everything. Turns out, the lead prosecutor on James' case, Richard Stokes, had a history, pattern, of suppressing exculpatory evidence. In James' case, there was security footage from a second camera across the street, never shown at trial. That camera had a timestamp, and it showed a man running 10 minutes before James had even clocked out of work. Stokes had seen that tape and buried it. James filed a habeas corpus motion, representing himself, cited Brady violations, demanded an evidentiary hearing. He went before a judge after 17 years not as a prisoner, but as a legal mind who knew the system better than half the attorneys in the room. He presented his case calmly, methodically. The judge listened, and for the first time, someone heard him. 3 months later, James Carter walked out of prison, a free man. But here's the thing, he didn't stop there. He had a fire in him now, not just to reclaim his own life, but to expose the man who took it away, Richard Stokes. By now, Stokes wasn't just a prosecutor. He was a district attorney, with ambitions of running for state attorney general. Big fish. Big spotlight. But James had something Stokes didn't. Truth. He went public, started speaking at rallies, telling his story, giving interviews. He even got a small legal fellowship with a justice reform group. He reopened the cases of 3 other men Stokes had prosecuted. Found the same patterns: missing evidence, coerced confessions, unreliable witnesses. Then it happened. A mysterious package showed up at James' tiny office. No return address. Inside, internal emails, signed affidavits, copies of files that had never been seen in court, documents proving that Stokes had knowingly buried exculpatory evidence in at least 7 cases. One case involved a mentally disabled teen who had confessed after being interrogated for 19 hours without a lawyer. Another involved a single mother who'd lost custody of her child over a charge Stokes knew wouldn't hold up. James was stunned. It wasn't just corruption. It was surgical, calculated, cold. He brought it to the Justice Department. They dragged their feet. He gave it to journalists. They ran a small story. But the big networks ignored it. Stokes had too many friends, too much power. James knew he'd have to do something big, something they couldn't ignore. He gathered the families of the wrongfully convicted. He filed a joint civil suit. Then he did the unthinkable. He filed a petition to have Stokes disbarred. The legal community exploded. Some called him a hero. Others said he was reckless. But one thing was clear. He wasn't scared anymore. And that's when it happened. James received a subpoena. Not for the disbarment hearing. Not for a civil case. But for a grand jury investigation. Someone was finally listening. But here's the twist. The morning James was scheduled to testify, his apartment was broken into. Files stolen. Laptop gone. Flash drive missing. Nothing else was touched. No TV. No cash. Just evidence. James was shaken. He went into hiding for a week. No calls. No messages. Then he resurfaced with a backup copy. You see, James knew the game. And he knew men like Stokes didn't play fair. But James was no longer playing fair either. And what he reveals next could send one of the most powerful prosecutors in the state to prison. Could overturn 7 more convictions. Could expose a ring of corruption that reaches far beyond one courtroom. But the question is, will they let him speak? He had the truth, the documents, the courage, and a name that no longer belonged to a prisoner, but to a man who shook the foundations of power. But what happens when power fights back? Let's just say, James thought the worst was behind him. He had no idea how wrong he was. The night before he was set to testify, someone broke into his apartment. Didn't take anything valuable. Didn't even bother to hide the fact that they were there. They only wanted one thing: his files. The same ones that proved District Attorney Richard Stokes had built his career by sending innocent people to prison. But James? He wasn't just smart. He was prepared. He'd made backups. Stashed one at a trusted friend's office. Another hidden in a bank deposit box under an alias. And one more, in plain sight. He brought the last copy with him the next morning. Inside a weathered manila envelope. Hands steady. Ice cold. At the courthouse, James sat before the grand jury. 12 people, a mix of civilians and former attorneys. All staring at the man whose name had quietly become a symbol for redemption and rebellion. He laid it out. The falsified reports. The suppressed surveillance video. The bribed forensic tech. The fact that Stokes had quietly settled 2 internal whistleblower complaints using taxpayer money, hidden behind sealed court records. He watched their faces shift, from disbelief to anger to fear. Then he said something that made the room go completely silent. He said, "This wasn't just Stokes acting alone. This was an operation, a system." He had names, emails, bank records, and something else, a confession, from a former assistant district attorney, on tape, detailing how Stokes had coached witnesses, manipulated juries, and even traded favors with certain judges for favorable rulings. It was explosive, too big to bury, too risky to ignore. The grand jury recessed. The courthouse buzzed like a hornet's nest. Reporters outside were already sniffing around. Something big was happening, and everyone could feel it. James stepped outside. thinking maybe, just maybe, this might be the beginning of real justice. But that's when it got darker. Way darker. That night, James got a call. Blocked number. Muffled voice. All they said was, "You should have stayed quiet." Then they hung up. Next day, the story breaks. But not the one James expected. The headlines weren't about corruption or wrongful convictions. They were about James Carter, convicted felon turned activist under investigation for evidence tampering. Sources question motives of ex-convict in Stokes' case. Is this justice or revenge? They flipped the script. Just like that, suddenly James was the one being investigated. He wasn't just fighting the system now. The system was fighting him. He tried to reach the reporter who promised to cover his full story. Voicemail. Tried again. Nothing. He went back to the nonprofit legal center that helped him. They told him they were reevaluating their involvement due to public perception. Even his old public defender, the one who barely defended him years ago, went on record saying, "Sometimes people can't let go of their past." It was like watching the truth dissolve in slow motion. But James wasn't done. He filed a motion with the state Supreme Court to open a formal misconduct inquiry against Stokes. It was a bold move, the kind of thing you don't come back from. Then, the retaliation got physical. His car was vandalized, tires slashed, threats scrawled on his door, and then, someone followed him. He noticed it late one night leaving a community meeting. A black sedan with no plates kept showing up. At the grocery store, outside his building, across the street from his mother's house. James started carrying pepper spray. Not that it would help much if things got serious. He knew what this was. Intimidation. Pure and simple. But James? He didn't scare easy. Because the fear of going back. Back behind those steel bars. Back to being silenced. Back to being nothing. Was far worse than any shadow on the street. So he did what he always did. He went back to the law. He filed a formal protection request. He gathered allies, small journalists, prison advocates, even a few sympathetic attorneys. He uploaded digital copies of all his evidence to 3 separate encrypted cloud drives. He scheduled them to automatically send to the press if something happened to him. And then he made the boldest move yet. He leaked the confession. That recording, the one from the assistant DA. He released it, online, raw and uncut. It hit like a tidal wave. Stokes went silent. His office issued a statement calling it manipulated audio. But it was too late. People were listening. Finally, 2 of Stokes' former staffers resigned within days. One agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. Then came the real blow. The judge who had presided over James' original trial, the one who sat silent while evidence was ignored, was now being investigated for judicial misconduct. It was happening. The house of cards was collapsing. But James didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Because he knew something most people didn't. He knew they had one more move left. And he was right. That same week, James received a letter from the State Bar Association. They were revoking his legal fellowship, claiming he'd practiced law without a license, that he'd interfered in ongoing criminal investigations. The irony? They only cared because he was winning, because he'd proven that someone without a law degree could still tell the truth. Louder, clearer, and more honestly than any courtroom full of suits ever could. James didn't stop. He filed an emergency appeal to reinstate the fellowship. He called a press conference, his first ever. He stood on the courthouse steps and said, "They tried to bury me once, but I planted roots. And now I'm growing where they never wanted me to." It went viral. Millions of views. Hashtags. Protests. Demands. The state couldn't ignore it anymore. A special independent prosecutor was appointed to investigate Stokes. James was asked to testify again, this time in a criminal trial. This was it. The final battle. The beginning of the end. But just as the trial date was announced, James disappeared. No calls. No texts. No last post. No note. His apartment, intact. Nothing broken. Nothing missing. Just empty. And left on his desk? One thing. A single flash drive, labeled, "If anything happens to me, play this." What's on that drive? Did James uncover something deeper than anyone expected? Is this just the system trying to silence him one last time? Or is he about to expose something bigger, more dangerous, and more corrupt than we ever imagined? If you believe in truth, justice, and the voices that refuse to be silenced, subscribe. Share the story. Let it spread, because part 2 is coming.